What happened to the bank robbers who vanished into thin air? The year was 1972, a time when rotary phones still lined the walls of modest homes and vinyl records spun stories of love and rebellion. In the small Midwestern town of Maplewood, life moved at a predictable pace until one fateful Tuesday in late September. It was just after noon when three masked men burst into the First National Bank on Main Street. They moved with military precision, their faces obscured by crude ski masks that made them look like ghosts haunting the quiet institution. Customers froze mid-transaction. Tellers raised trembling hands as one of the robbers barked orders through his mask. "Fill it up," he growled, shoving an empty duffel bag across the counter. Witnesses later described the scene in hushed tones. The sharp metallic clang of cash drawers being yanked open, the cold glint of a revolver pointed unwaveringly at the bank manager's chest. Within minutes, the thieves had stuffed over $200,000 in cash into the duffel bags. Enough to make headlines, but not enough to retire on. As they backed toward the door, the leader turned to the terrified crowd. "Don't be heroes," he warned before disappearing out the front entrance. Outside, a black sedan idled at the curb, its engine purring like a predator ready to pounce. Witnesses reported seeing the trio sprint to the car, throwing the heavy duffel bags into the trunk before climbing inside. Tires screeched against asphalt as the vehicle peeled away from the curb, heading straight for the outskirts of town. And then, nothing. No trace of the robbers or their stolen loot ever surfaced. Law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. Officers dredged nearby rivers, searching for weighted-down sacks of cash. They combed through abandoned barns and forgotten warehouses, hoping to uncover evidence of a hideout. Yet every lead fizzled out, leaving investigators frustrated and the townsfolk uneasy. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves caught in a gust. Some claimed the robbers had fled the country, boarding a plane under false identities. Others whispered about secret tunnels beneath Maplewood, built during Prohibition and now used by criminals seeking refuge. A few even suggested supernatural intervention, a curse placed on the money itself, condemning those who touched it to eternal wandering. But no matter how many theories circulated, the truth remained elusive. The case grew colder with each passing month, eventually relegated to the dusty archives of unsolved crimes. For decades, it lingered as little more than a local legend, a cautionary tale told around dinner tables and coffee shops. Yet buried beneath layers of speculation and hearsay lay a question that refused to die. What really happened to the robbers and their ill-gotten fortune? And why did their daring escape culminate in such complete and utter disappearance? As the years rolled on, memories of the robbery faded, but not entirely. For some, the mystery became personal. One such person was Eleanor Grayson, a retired school teacher whose father had been among the first officers on the scene that day. She often found herself staring at the old newspaper clippings her father had saved, wondering if there wasn't something everyone else had missed. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were closer than anyone realized, and that unraveling the truth might require looking beyond logic and delving deep into the shadows of Maplewood's past. Little did she know, her curiosity would soon thrust her into a web far darker and more intricate than she could have imagined. As the decades passed, the 1972 bank robbery became less of a crime and more of a ghost story, a spectral tale that haunted the collective memory of Maplewood. The details blurred with time, reshaped by imagination and hearsay until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But one thing remained constant: the unanswered questions. The most persistent rumor involved something otherworldly. Some claimed the thieves had made a pact with forces beyond comprehension, invoking powers they couldn't control. It wasn't just luck, old-timers would say, in hushed tones over cups of weak diner coffee. They disappeared like smoke because something took them. This theory gained traction after strange occurrences were reported near the outskirts of town shortly after the heist. Lights flickering in empty fields, eerie howls carried on the wind, livestock found dead without explanation. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as rural superstition, but believers swore the robbers had crossed into territory meant for neither the living nor the dead. Others leaned toward a darker, more human explanation: betrayal. According to this version of events, the trio never intended to share the spoils. Instead, an accomplice, or perhaps all three conspiring against each other, turned on their partners once the money was secured. Bodies were said to be buried in unmarked graves scattered across forgotten corners of the countryside. Proponents of this theory pointed to the absence of any trace of the robbers, not even a fingerprint, as proof that someone had gone to great lengths to erase every shred of evidence. It was a chilling thought, suggesting that greed had devoured not only the stolen cash, but also the souls of those who sought it. Then there was the romanticized notion that the thieves had pulled off the ultimate disappearing act, faking their deaths and slipping away to start new lives under assumed identities. In this telling, the men weren't criminals at all. They were masterminds, chess players who had planned their escape down to the last detail. Locals like to imagine them sipping Mai Tais on tropical beaches or running small businesses in distant cities, their past crimes nothing more than a shadow they'd left behind. This theory offered a sense of poetic justice, implying that the robbers had outsmarted both fate and law enforcement. For Eleanor Grayson, these stories were more than idle chatter. They were threads in a tapestry she longed to unravel. Her father's involvement in the original investigation gave her a personal stake in the mystery, though he rarely spoke about it. When she pressed him as a child, he'd simply shake his head and mutter, "Some things are better left alone." Those words stuck with her, gnawing at her curiosity like a splinter beneath the skin. But now, years later, Eleanor couldn't ignore the pull any longer. Retired from teaching and living alone since her husband's passing, she found herself drawn to the attic where her father's box of mementos gathered dust. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, grainy photographs of the bank's exterior, and scribbled notes from interviews with witnesses. Flipping through the pages, Eleanor noticed patterns no one else seemed to have caught. Contradictions in witness statements, overlooked connections between key players, and a single name mentioned only once in passing, Reverend Hargrove. Who was Reverend Hargrove? And why did his name appear alongside cryptic references to the woods and a meeting before dawn? These fragments felt like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled, yet the picture they formed eluded her. Still, Eleanor sensed she was onto something, a clue that might finally shed light on what truly happened that autumn day in 1972. Though most of Maplewood had moved on, relegating the robbery to the realm of folklore, Eleanor knew the truth was still out there, buried beneath layers of time and secrecy. She resolved to dig deeper, unaware that her quest would lead her down paths darker and more dangerous than anything she could have anticipated. For in seeking answers, she risked awakening secrets that some people, and perhaps even some things, wanted to keep hidden forever. Clara Whitaker sat on the porch of her modest home, sipping chamomile tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods, mingling with memories she'd tried to bury for decades. At 72, Clara had lived a quiet life in Willow Creek, a small town just outside Maplewood. But lately, the whispers of the past had begun to creep back into her thoughts, whispers tied to that fateful day in 1972. She remembered it vividly, the shockwaves that rippled through the community after the First National Bank robbery. It wasn't just the audacity of the crime, it was the eerie silence that followed. No arrests, no explanations, just an unsettling void where answers should have been. For weeks afterward, townsfolk gathered at diners and gas stations, trading theories and casting suspicious glances at neighbors. Trust eroded like sand beneath a rising tide. What few people knew, however, was that Clara's late husband, Richard, had been closer to the mystery than anyone realized. A skilled mechanic with grease-stained hands and a knack for fixing anything with an engine, Richard worked at Joe's Auto Repair on the edge of town. His garage wasn't just a place to mend cars. It was a hub of gossip and whispered confessions. Customers often lingered longer than necessary, chatting about everything from football scores to local scandals. And in the days leading up to the robbery, Richard began noticing something unusual, a shift in tone among certain patrons. "They're talking funny," he told Clara one evening over dinner, his brow furrowed. "Not outright saying anything wrong, but dropping hints, like they know something big is coming." Clara hadn't thought much of it at the time. People always talked too much when they were nervous or excited, and Richard had a habit of reading too deeply into casual conversations. But then came the robbery, and Richard's sudden departure from Willow Creek. It happened less than a month later. One morning, Clara woke to find Richard packing a suitcase. He said he needed to take a trip, something about visiting an old friend in Chicago. She begged him to explain, but he only kissed her forehead and promised he'd be back soon. Days turned into weeks, then months. Eventually, she received word that Richard had died in a car accident outside Des Moines. A tragic end to a man who had always been careful behind the wheel. For years, Clara convinced herself there was no connection between Richard's disappearance and the bank robbery. Grief clouded her judgment, and she clung to the hope that his death had been nothing more than a heartbreaking coincidence. But now, sitting alone on her porch with the weight of decades pressing down on her, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Richard had known more than he let on. The old mill stood like a specter on the edge of Willow Creek, its weathered wooden beams sagging under the weight of time. Decades of neglect had left it cloaked in ivy and shadows, its once bustling activity replaced by an eerie stillness. To most townsfolk, it was nothing more than a relic, a crumbling monument to a bygone era. But Clara knew better. The note she'd found among Richard's belongings mentioned the mill explicitly. Start where the river bends. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw her here. Armed with a flashlight and a determination that belied her age, Clara stepped cautiously inside. The air smelled damp and earthy, laced with the faint tang of rust from long-abandoned machinery. Her footsteps echoed softly against the rotting floorboards as she moved deeper into the cavernous space. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting jagged patterns across the room like fractured memories. It didn't take long for Clara to notice something unusual. Near the back wall, partially concealed beneath a pile of decaying sacks and splintered crates, was a section of flooring that looked newer than the rest. Kneeling down, she brushed away layers of dust and debris until her fingers grazed cold metal. A handle. With some effort, she tugged at it, revealing a trapdoor that creaked open to expose a dark void below. Her heart raced as she shone her flashlight into the opening. A ladder descended into what appeared to be a narrow passageway carved out of raw stone. The tunnels stretched farther than she could see, their purpose unclear. What would a grain mill need with such an elaborate underground network? And why go to such lengths to hide it? Descending slowly, Clara felt the temperature drop the deeper she went. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She followed the twisting path, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Every few feet, she noticed strange markings etched into the stone, symbols she didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. The tunnels branched off in multiple directions, forming a labyrinthine maze. Clara paused at one intersection, trying to decide which way to go. That's when she saw it, a glint of something metallic embedded in the dirt near her feet. Bending down, she unearthed a small brass key, tarnished with age but unmistakably man-made. Its presence here felt significant, though she couldn't yet say why. Further exploration revealed more clues scattered throughout the tunnels. In one alcove, she discovered a rusted toolbox containing tools far too advanced for milling operations, precision instruments designed for cutting or drilling into hard surfaces. Nearby, she found scraps of fabric caught on jagged rocks, faded but unmistakably part of a dark garment. Could these remnants belong to the bank robbers? But it was the final discovery that sent chills racing up her spine. Deep within the maze, Clara stumbled upon a chamber unlike any other. The walls were lined with shelves crammed full of ledgers and journals, their spines cracked and brittle with age. At the center of the room sat a workbench covered in yellowed papers and maps. One map, spread wide and weighted down by stones, depicted the surrounding countryside, including the exact route the getaway car might have taken after fleeing the bank. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the documents. Among them were handwritten notes detailing dates, times, and locations, not just for the 1972 robbery, but for several others spanning nearly 2 decades. Someone had been using this place not only as a hideout, but also as a command center for organized crime. And then there was the name scrawled repeatedly in faded ink on the margins of the papers, Reverend Hargrove. The pieces began falling into place, though the picture they formed was darker and more complex than Clara could have imagined. Whoever Reverend Hargrove was, he wasn't merely connected to the robbery. He seemed to be orchestrating something far larger. And if Richard had known about this place, his sudden departure and untimely death took on a sinister new meaning. Clara realized she was no longer just chasing answers about the past. She was stepping into a web of secrets that someone had killed to protect. As she carefully gathered what evidence she could carry, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Somewhere in the shadows, the tunnels whispered their warnings, but Clara pressed on, driven by a mix of grief, curiosity, and resolve. Whatever truth lay buried beneath the old mill, she intended to uncover it, even if it meant confronting forces far beyond her understanding. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the brittle pages of the ledger, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. She had discovered it tucked away in a dusty trunk in the attic of Maplewood Retirement Home, where she volunteered twice a week. The trunk itself was unremarkable, a relic donated years ago by the family of the mill's last owner, but its contents hinted at something far more sinister. The entries inside were meticulous, written in neat cursive that spoke of a man who valued precision. Each page detailed shipments labeled only as special cargo, accompanied by dates, weights, and destinations. What caught Clara's attention first were the timestamps. Several matched the weeks leading up to and immediately following the 1972 bank robbery. It wasn't just coincidence. It felt like confirmation that the mill had played a role in whatever unfolded that day. But one entry stopped her cold. Dated 3 days after the robbery, it listed a payment of $5,000 made to someone identified only as R.W. Clara stared at the initials, her breath catching in her throat. They matched her late husband's name, Richard Whitaker. Her mind raced. Why would Richard's name appear in this ledger? Was he involved in the robbery itself? Or had he simply been paid for his silence? The thought clawed at her heart, stirring emotions she hadn't confronted in decades. Richard had always been kind, dependable, and honest. At least, that's what she'd believed. Could he have kept such a monumental secret from her? Flipping through the rest of the ledger, Clara uncovered more unsettling details. Some shipments were marked with cryptic notes like urgent delivery or secure transport, while others referenced locations deep in the woods surrounding Willow Creek. One particularly chilling entry read, "Cargo secured. Await further instructions from R.H. Reverend Hargrove again." The connection between the mill, the mysterious shipments, and Reverend Hargrove grew clearer with each passing moment. But how did Richard fit into all of this? Had he been coerced into helping, perhaps under threat to their safety? Or had greed driven him to make choices he later regretted? Clara closed the ledger, her thoughts swirling like autumn leaves caught in a storm. She couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd found, nor could she dismiss the growing suspicion that Richard's death might not have been an accident at all. If he had been tangled up in this web of crime and deception, then his sudden departure from Willow Creek and the circumstances surrounding his supposed car accident began to take on a darker hue. As she carefully wrapped the ledger in a cloth and placed it in her bag, Clara resolved to dig deeper. Whatever truths lay buried in these records, they were too important to leave untouched. And if uncovering them meant confronting painful realities about the man she loved, so be it. For Clara, the stakes had shifted from mere curiosity to something far more personal. Justice for Richard, and closure for herself. Little did she know, the ledger was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, someone else knew about its existence, and they wouldn't hesitate to ensure it stayed hidden forever. The Maplewood Historical Society was a modest brick building tucked behind rows of oak trees, its windows framed by ivy that seemed to embrace the structure like an old friend. Clara had come here seeking answers, hoping the archives might hold some overlooked detail about the mill or its former owner. What she found instead was someone who shared her obsession with the past, Frank O'Connell. Frank sat alone at a corner table, poring over a stack of yellowed case files. At 75, his hair was silver and thinning, but his sharp blue eyes still carried the intensity of a man who refused to let go of unfinished business. When Clara approached him, hesitantly introducing herself, In explaining her interest in the 1972 robbery, he regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "You're wasting your time," he said gruffly, closing one of the folders. "That case is colder than January frost. Trust me, I've been chasing shadows for 40 years. But Clara wasn't deterred. She explained her discoveries so far: the hidden tunnels beneath the mill, the mysterious ledger, and the initials linking Richard to the operation. As she spoke, she saw something shift in Frank's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even hope. "W, you said," he asked, leaning forward slightly. "Richard Whitaker, the mechanic?" Clara nodded, surprised that Frank knew the name. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his sparse hair. "I remember him. Never could prove anything. But there were whispers back then. People said he overheard things he shouldn't have, things that made him nervous enough to leave town in a hurry." Frank hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust her. Finally, he relented. "Look, I'll admit it. I never stopped thinking about this case. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. If you're serious about finding the truth, maybe we can help each other." And just like that, an unlikely partnership was forged. Over the next few days, Clara and Frank worked tirelessly, combing through old testimonies, police reports, and maps. They met in Frank's cluttered home office, surrounded by shelves sagging under the weight of binders and photographs. His walls were adorned with timelines and notes pinned haphazardly, evidence of decades spent trying to solve the unsolvable. One breakthrough came when they revisited witness statements from the day of the robbery. Several people mentioned seeing the getaway car speed toward the outskirts of town, but no one could agree on where it went after that. Some claimed it vanished near the river. Others swore it headed straight for the woods surrounding Willow Creek. "That's because they didn't see the whole picture," Frank muttered, tapping a faded map of the area. "They were looking above ground. No one thought to look below." Clara's pulse quickened. "The tunnels," she whispered. Frank nodded. "Exactly. Whoever planned this job knew exactly what they were doing. They used the mill's underground network to slip away unnoticed. That kind of insider knowledge doesn't come easy. It means someone on the inside was helping them." As they pieced together fragments of testimony, another pattern emerged. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the mill in the weeks leading up to the robbery. One elderly woman even remembered overhearing two men arguing about timing and cargo. Though none of these accounts had seemed significant at the time, they now pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan involving not just the robbers, but accomplices familiar with the mill's secrets. Frank leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "If we're right about this, then whoever helped those guys escape didn't do it out of loyalty. They did it for money. Or worse, leverage." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "You think Reverend Hargrove was involved?" Frank's jaw tightened. Hargrove was a slippery character, charismatic, well-liked, but also ambitious. If he thought he could profit off something like this, I wouldn't put it past him. For Clara, the implications were staggering. Not only was she uncovering the truth about the robbery, but she was also beginning to understand the role her husband may have played in it, and the danger he might have faced as a result. Together, she and Frank vowed to keep digging, knowing full well that the closer they got to the truth, the greater the risk became. By the end of their meeting, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Frank's expertise and her determination, they stood a fighting chance of unraveling the mystery once and for all. But as they parted ways, Frank offered a grim warning. "Be careful, Clara. People don't forget, and they don't forgive. If anyone finds out what we're on to, we won't just be chasing ghosts. We'll be running from them." The deeper Clara and Frank delved into Willow Creek's history, the more the town revealed itself to be a labyrinth of secrets. What had once seemed like a quiet, unassuming community now felt like a place where danger lurked beneath every surface, hidden in plain sight, yet meticulously concealed from prying eyes. One rainy afternoon, while sifting through dusty archives at the Historical Society, Clara stumbled upon a faded pamphlet tucked inside an old book about local landmarks. The pamphlet depicted the mill as it stood in its heyday, a bustling hub of commerce with grain wagons lined up outside and workers hauling sacks under the watchful gaze of its original owner, Silas Marlowe. But what caught Clara's attention wasn't the image itself. It was the insignia printed in the corner. A serpent coiled around a key, its forked tongue flicking toward 3 stars. "What is this?" she murmured, holding the pamphlet up for Frank to see. Frank squinted at it, his brow furrowing. "That symbol, I've seen it before. It belonged to a group called the Order of the Serpent. They were active in these parts during the early 1900s. Clara frowned. "An order? Like a secret society?" "Exactly," Frank replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. He rummaged through his notes until he found a newspaper clipping, dated 1923. The headline read, "Local businessman denies allegations of smuggling ring involvement." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of none other than Silas Marlowe, looking defiant as reporters swarmed him outside the mill. "They weren't just smuggling goods," Frank explained, tapping the article. "Rumors said they dealt in everything from bootleg liquor during Prohibition to stolen artifacts. Some even claimed they dabbled in human trafficking, or worse." Clara shuddered. "And you think this group might still exist today?" "I don't know," Frank admitted. "But if they do, it would explain a lot. The tunnels under the mill, the coded entries in the ledger, the references to special cargo, it all points to something bigger than a simple bank robbery. Maybe the robbers were members trying to pull off one last score? Or maybe," he trailed off, his expression darkening. "Maybe they were victims," Clara finished softly. The thought sent a chill racing down her spine. If the thieves hadn't orchestrated their own escape, if someone else had used them as pawns, it added a sinister layer to the mystery. Were the men dead? Buried somewhere no one would ever find them? Or had they been silenced in some other way? To test their theory, Clara and Frank decided to visit the oldest resident of Willow Creek, Edith Monroe, a spry 92-year-old widow who lived in a quaint cottage on the edge of town. Known for her sharp memory and love of storytelling, Edith was a living repository of local lore. When they arrived, she greeted them warmly, offering tea and homemade apple pie before settling into her favorite armchair. "You want to know about Silas Marlowe and his little club, don't you?" Edith asked with a knowing smile, her bright eyes twinkling. "Everyone whispered about them back then, said they met in the woods at night, wearing robes and chanting nonsense. Folks joked that they worshiped the devil, but I always figured they were just crooks looking for a thrill." Clara exchanged a glance with Frank. "Did anyone ever try to shut them down?" "Oh, sure," Edith replied, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The sheriff came sniffing around a few times, but nothing stuck. Silas was too clever. He covered his tracks well. Besides, half the town owed him favors. If you wanted your crops milled or your goods shipped, you played nice with Silas and his friends." As Edith spoke, Clara couldn't help but wonder how far the influence of the Order of the Serpent extended, and whether its legacy had shaped the events of 1972. Had Reverend Hargrove been part of the group? Was Richard drawn into their web without realizing it? Each question only led to more uncertainty, deepening the tangled knot of the past. Before leaving, Clara asked one final question. "Do you think the Order still exists today?" Edith chuckled, though there was a hint of unease in her voice. "Honey, some things never die. They just learn to hide better." On the drive home, neither Clara nor Frank spoke. The weight of what they'd learned hung heavy between them, casting long shadows over their investigation. If the robbers had crossed paths with a secret society, it raised unsettling possibilities. Not just about their fate, but about the forces that might still be watching, waiting, and guarding the truth. For Clara, the stakes had grown impossibly high. She wasn't just chasing answers anymore. She was treading on ground soaked with decades of secrets, where every step could awaken dangers long buried. And yet she knew she couldn't turn back. Not when the truth might finally bring peace to Richard's memory, and justice to those who deserved it. The photograph was small, no larger than a playing card, its edges worn soft from years of handling. It had been tucked inside the ledger Clara found in the attic, almost as if someone meant to hide it, or preserve it for the right eyes to find. When she held it up to the light streaming through Frank's office window, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, Richard, younger, his face unlined by time, standing beside two men whose features were partially obscured by shadows. All three wore casual clothing, jeans, flannel shirts, but there was something tense in their posture, as though they weren't entirely comfortable being photographed together. Behind them loomed the silhouette of the old mill, its windows dark and hollow like empty eye sockets. "Do you recognize either of these men?" Frank asked, leaning closer to examine the photo. Clara shook her head, slowly, her gaze fixed on Richard's familiar smile. "No, but this changes everything. Why would Richard be meeting with strangers near the mill? And why keep this picture hidden?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the photo over and noticed faint handwriting on the back. October 1972. "Trust is thin." The words sent a shiver down both their spines. Whoever wrote them clearly understood the fragility of alliances, and perhaps the dangers lurking within them. Over the next few days, Clara and Frank widened their search, seeking out elderly residents who might recall rumors or details about the robbers themselves. One name kept surfacing during their interviews: Tommy Fingers Grayson, a local safecracker rumored to have vanished around the same time as the robbery. Another was Victor Lane, a drifter known for his quick temper and even quicker hands. Both men fit descriptions given by witnesses at the scene, though neither had ever been formally identified as suspects. Then came Maggie Hensley, an 86-year-old former waitress at the Willow Creek Diner, who claimed she'd overheard a heated argument between two men shortly before the robbery. They were arguing about splitting something evenly, Maggie recalled, her voice trembling with age but still sharp with memory. One of them said, "We can't trust him. He'll talk." I thought nothing of it at the time, but later, after the robbery, well, I wondered if they were talking about cutting someone out. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Cutting someone out? How?" Maggie hesitated, her cloudy eyes narrowing. "Dead men tell no tales, dear. That's what my daddy used to say." The implication hung heavy in the air. If one of the robbers had been betrayed by his partners, it added a grim new dimension to the mystery. Had two of the thieves double-crossed the third, leaving him behind, perhaps fatally, as they fled with the money? And could that third man have been connected to Richard? Back at Frank's house, Clara spread the evidence across the dining table. The faded photograph, the ledger entries mentioning RW, and notes from their interviews. She stared at the image of Richard, her mind racing. Was he merely an innocent bystander, unwittingly pulled into the orbit of dangerous men? Or had he played a more active role, one he never confessed to her? "Let's assume for a moment that Richard wasn't involved directly in the robbery," Frank said, breaking the silence. "But maybe he knew too much. Maybe he saw or heard something he shouldn't have." Clara nodded slowly. "Like the argument Maggie mentioned. What if Richard overheard it? Or worse, what if he helped them somehow, thinking he was doing a favor, only to realize later what he'd gotten himself into?" It was a chilling theory, but it made sense. Richard's sudden departure from Willow Creek, followed by his untimely death, took on a darker significance. If he'd stumbled upon evidence of betrayal, or worse, been coerced into aiding the robbers, it could explain why he left so abruptly and why someone might have wanted to silence him permanently. As Clara studied the photograph again, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a glint of metal in one of the unidentified men's hands. Zooming in with her phone's camera, she realized it was a knife, its blade catching the sunlight. The sight of it filled her with dread. This wasn't just a casual meeting. It was a moment fraught with tension, possibly even violence. "Whoever these men are," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, "they hold the key to everything." Frank placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find out who they are, Clara, and when we do, we'll finally know the truth. Not just about the robbery, but about Richard's part in all of this." But as they continued piecing together the fragments of the past, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement outside the window, seemed to carry a warning. Someone didn't want these secrets unearthed, and they might already know how close Clara and Frank were getting. The question was, how far would they go to stop them? The air in the tunnels was thick and unyielding, pressing against Clara's lungs as she and Frank moved deeper into the labyrinth beneath the mill. The beam of their flashlights cut through the suffocating darkness, revealing walls slick with moisture and jagged stones that seemed to close in around them. Every step echoed eerily, a reminder of how far they were from the world above, and how isolated they'd be if something went wrong. Guided by the map Clara had found among Reverend Hargrove's papers, they followed a twisting path that led to a sealed-off chamber. The door was crude but sturdy, constructed of rotting wood reinforced with rusted iron bars. It took both of them straining against it to pry it open, the hinges groaning in protest as decades of neglect gave way. Inside, the room was small but telling, a grim snapshot frozen in time. Discarded tools lay scattered across the dirt floor. Crowbars, chisels, and lengths of rope, all coated in a fine layer of dust. Nearby, crumpled clothing hinted at hasty movements. Jackets, gloves, and boots, abandoned as though their owners had no further use for them. But it was the safe that drew their attention first. It sat in the corner, its metal surface corroded and pitted with age. Frank knelt beside it, running his fingers over the lock mechanism. "This must have held some of the stolen money," he murmured. With effort, he forced it open, revealing fragments of damp, moldy cash inside. Not all of it, though, just enough to confirm this place had been part of the robbers' plan. Clara crouched beside him, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. "They didn't take everything," she said softly. "Why leave any behind?" "Maybe they were interrupted," Frank suggested, his voice low. "Or maybe—" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the far side of the chamber. There, partially concealed beneath a pile of debris, was something far more haunting than discarded loot or tools. Skeletal remains lay wrapped in tattered fabric, the material fragile and disintegrating under the faintest touch. As Clara approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminated an insignia stitched onto what remained of the fabric, a crest matching the uniforms worn by bank employees in 1972. Her breath hitched. This isn't one of the robbers." Frank nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. "No, this is someone who worked at the bank, one of the hostages." The realization hit them like a cold wind snaking through the tunnels. Whoever orchestrated the robbery hadn't just betrayed their accomplices, they'd left witnesses behind as well. Whether this poor soul had been killed accidentally during the escape or deliberately silenced afterward, there was no denying the brutality of it. And given the condition of the body, it was clear no one had intended for it to be found. Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but she forced herself to focus. She reached out carefully, brushing aside more of the debris to reveal additional details. A tarnished name tag clung stubbornly to the fabric, its letters barely legible. J. Carter. "Joseph Carter," Frank muttered, consulting his notes. "He was listed as missing after the robbery. His family never knew what happened to him." "They thought he ran off with the money," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "But he didn't run anywhere." As they continued examining the scene, another discovery sent fresh chills coursing through them. Near the skeleton, half buried in the dirt, was a leather wallet containing identification cards belonging to two men, Tommy Fingers Grayson and Victor Lane, the suspected double-crossers. Alongside the IDs were faded Polaroid photographs showing the pair counting stacks of cash in what appeared to be this very chamber. "It looks like they came back here to divide the spoils," Frank said, his tone heavy with dread. But something went wrong. Clara stared at the images, her mind racing. If these two had returned to the tunnels after the robbery, only to meet their end here, then who or what had stopped them? And where was the rest of the money? Her thoughts turned to Richard once more. Could he have been involved in whatever transpired down here? Had he tried to intervene, only to become collateral damage? Or worse, had he helped orchestrate the betrayal, earning himself a target on his back? Before they could explore those questions further, a sound echoed through the tunnels, a faint scraping noise like footsteps disturbing loose gravel. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, gripping her flashlight tighter. Frank nodded, his expression grim. "We're not alone." The realization sent a jolt of panic through them, but also clarity. Someone else knew about this place, and now that Clara and Frank had uncovered its secrets, they might not be allowed to leave alive. The pocket watch glinted faintly in the beam of Clara's flashlight, its tarnished surface catching the light like a shard of memory slicing through time. She recognized it instantly, the intricate engraving on the back, the initials RW etched into the metal. It had been a gift from her on their 5th wedding anniversary, a token of love she thought lost forever when Richard disappeared. Her knees buckled slightly as the weight of what she was seeing crashed over her. This is his," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence of the tunnels. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out to touch it, but Frank gently stopped her. "We need to document everything before we disturb the scene," he said quietly, though his own hands trembled as he snapped photos with his phone. His tone softened. "Clara, I'm so sorry." She nodded numbly, clutching the edge of her jacket to steady herself. This wasn't how she'd imagined finding answers about Richard's disappearance or his death. Somewhere deep inside, she clung to the hope that he'd simply walked away, that there was some explanation for why he left her behind. But now, staring at the evidence sprawled across the dirt floor of this forgotten tomb, she knew the truth. Richard hadn't chosen to leave. He'd been murdered. Frank carefully collected the watch and placed it in an evidence bag along with other items found near the remains. Fragments of fabric, scraps of personal belongings, and most damning of all, a blood-stained handkerchief bearing traces of DNA. Later analysis would confirm what they already suspected. The skeletal remains belonged not only to Joseph Carter, the bank employee, but also to one of the suspected robbers, Tommy Fingers Grayson. "It looks like Tommy didn't make it out alive either," Frank murmured, examining the Polaroids again. "Whoever killed him left these pictures behind as proof, or maybe as a message." Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus despite the storm raging inside her. "And Richard," Frank hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Based on the position of the remains and the condition of the artifacts, I think Richard stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. Maybe he came down here looking for answers after overhearing those arguments Maggie mentioned. Or maybe," he paused, glancing at the pocket watch, "maybe he tried to blackmail them." Clara shook her head vehemently. "Richard wouldn't do that. He wasn't greedy or reckless." "No, but he was curious," Frank countered gently. "And if he saw an opportunity to protect you, if he thought exposing these men could keep you safe, he might have taken a risk. Either way, once he got too close, his fate was sealed." The theory made sickening sense. If Richard had confronted the robbers, or even attempted to cut a deal with them, they wouldn't have hesitated to eliminate him. After all, 2 of the thieves had already turned on their third partner. Adding another loose end wouldn't have troubled them. As Clara pieced together the final moments of the drama, a grim picture emerged. The surviving robbers, Victor Lane and whoever else may have been involved, likely fled separately, taking the bulk of the stolen money with them. They couldn't risk carrying Richard's body with them, so they left it behind, hidden among the debris in the tunnels where no one would think to look. Over time, the entrance to the chamber was sealed off, erasing any trace of their crimes until Clara and Frank unearthed the horrors buried within. But the question lingered. Why hadn't Victor Lane been caught? And where had the rest of the money gone? Back in Frank's office later that evening, they sifted through old records and cross-referenced names. One detail stood out: a property transfer dated 6 months after the robbery. A large tract of land near the outskirts of Willow Creek had been purchased under a false identity. The buyer? A man named Charles Hargrove, Reverend Hargrove's younger brother. "Hargrove must have been pulling strings the whole time," Frank muttered, slamming his fist against the desk. "He orchestrated the robbery, using his connections with the secret society, then cleaned up by betraying everyone involved. The Order of the Serpent doesn't tolerate loose ends." Clara sat silently, her mind reeling. All these years, she'd believed Richard died in a random accident far from home. Instead, he'd been caught in a web of greed and betrayal, spun by men who valued nothing. Not loyalty, not life itself. Her grief mingled with anger, sharp and unrelenting. "What do we do now?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Frank met her gaze, resolve hardening in his eyes. "We expose the truth, for Richard, for Joseph Carter, for everyone whose lives were destroyed because of this." For the first time since beginning her search, Clara felt a flicker of peace. Justice might be delayed, but it wouldn't be denied, not while she still drew breath. The climb back to the surface felt longer than the descent, each step heavy with the weight of what Clara had uncovered. The cool night air hit her face as she emerged from the tunnels, but it did little to ease the storm raging inside her. Richard's pocket watch rested in her palm, its familiar weight both a comfort and a reminder of all she had lost. Frank stood nearby, his expression somber but resolute. "You okay?" he asked softly, though they both knew the question was more formality than inquiry. Clara nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her composure. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted, staring out at the darkened horizon. "I always thought Richard left because of something I did, or didn't do, but now," her voice cracked, "now I know he died trying to protect me, or maybe to make things right. It doesn't erase the pain, but it helps." Frank placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He was a good man, Clara, and he deserves to be remembered that way." For the first time in decades, Clara allowed herself to grieve, not just for the husband she'd loved, but for the life they might have shared if fate hadn't intervened. Yet amidst the sorrow, there was also clarity. Knowing the truth, even a painful one, brought a measure of peace. Richard's memory could finally rest alongside the answers she'd fought so hard to find. As Clara turned to leave the mill grounds, something caught her eye, a faint indentation in the dusty floor of the tunnel entrance. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a scuff mark, but upon closer inspection, she realized it was a footprint. Fresh. Her pulse quickened. Who else knew about this place? And why were they here now? Without hesitation, Clara followed the trail of footprints deeper into the labyrinth, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder, heavier, until she reached a narrow alcove partially concealed by fallen beams. There, crouched over a pile of debris, was a figure clad in worn jeans and a hooded sweatshirt. He froze when he heard her approach, his wide eyes reflecting the beam of her light. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man raised his hands slowly, revealing dirt-streaked palms. "Just looking for something," he muttered, his tone defensive. "Didn't mean any harm." "What kind of something?" He hesitated, glancing around nervously before answering. "Money. My granddad used to talk about a stash hidden around here somewhere. Said it came from some big score back in the 70s. I thought, maybe I could find it." Clara's heart raced. Could this man be connected to the surviving robbers? Or their descendants? She pressed him further. "What's your name?" "Jake," he replied quickly. "Look, I don't want trouble. I swear." Before she could ask anything else, Jake bolted past her, disappearing into the shadows. Clara called after him, but his footsteps faded rapidly, swallowed by the maze of tunnels. Frustrated yet intrigued, she searched the area where he'd been digging and found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a loose stone. Unfolding it revealed a crudely drawn map marked with coordinates outside of town. Back in the safety of her home, Clara spread the map across her kitchen table, tracing the route with trembling fingers. The coordinates pointed to an isolated stretch of woodland miles from Willow Creek, a place she'd never ventured before. Part of her wanted to hand the map over to Frank, let him handle the next phase of the investigation. But another part, the part driven by grief, curiosity, and an unrelenting need for answers, urged her to see it through herself. She packed a small bag the following morning, loading it with essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and Richard's pocket watch. As she climbed into her car, she glanced at the map one last time, her resolve hardening. Whatever awaited her at those coordinates, Riches, danger, or something entirely unexpected. It was a chapter of the story she needed to write for herself. The road stretched ahead, winding through dense forests and rolling hills. Clara drove in the silence, the hum of the engine mingling with her racing thoughts. What would she find when she arrived? Closure, or another mystery waiting to unravel? The answer lay beyond the horizon, shrouded in uncertainty. And as Clara pressed onward, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done with her yet.